The Keddie Cabin Murders. In the remote, pine-covered mountains of the Sierra Nevada lies the former resort town of Keddie, a place of quiet, rustic charm and a deep, lingering shadow. In 1981, this tiny, isolated community became the setting for a horrific act of violence, a puzzle of baffling clues, strange suspects, and a profoundly mishandled investigation. The events that took place in Cabin 28 that spring night were so strange and so savage that the case has remained a source of dark fascination and intense debate for over 40 years. The cabin was home to the Sharp family, Glenna Sue Sharp, a 36-year-old single mother, and her 5 children. On the night of April 11, 1981, Sue was home with 4 of her children, 15-year-old John, 12-year-old Tina, and her 2 younger sons, Rick and Greg. Also in the cabin was a friend of the younger boys, Justin. The eldest daughter, 14-year-old Sheila, was spending the night in the cabin next door. The following morning, on April 12th, Sheila returned to Cabin 28 and walked into a scene of unimaginable horror. In the living room, she discovered the remains of her mother, her brother John, and John's 17-year-old friend Dana Wingate, who had been visiting. The 3 individuals had been bound with electrical wire and medical tape, and it was clear that a prolonged and terrible act of violence had taken place. The initial law enforcement response from the Plumas County Sheriff's Office was chaotic and would later be criticized as a catastrophic failure of police procedure. The crime scene, which should have been immediately sealed, was quickly contaminated by numerous officers and neighbors walking through the small cabin, potentially destroying or obscuring vital evidence. One of the first deputies on the scene, upon seeing the bindings, allegedly dismissed the event as a possible ritualistic act, a theory that may have clouded the investigation from the very start. One of the first strange details noted by investigators was the complete lack of any sign of a forced entry. The perpetrators, it seemed, had either been let into the cabin or had a key. Several potential instruments used in the act were found at the scene, including a steak knife that had been used with such force its blade was bent, and a hammer. But the scene was so compromised, it was difficult to piece together a clear sequence of events. As the initial shock wore off, a second, terrifying mystery emerged. Sue's 12-year-old daughter, Tina, was missing from the cabin. Her empty bed was found, and it appeared she had been taken from the home after the initial events. This transformed the case from a static crime scene into an active and desperate search for a missing child, adding another layer of urgency and tragedy to the investigation. Perhaps the most unnerving and baffling aspect of the entire case was the discovery of the 3 young boys, Sue's 2 sons, and their friend Justin, in the adjacent bedroom. They were alive and physically unharmed. The 3 children had apparently slept through the entire horrific event, or were so terrified by the sounds from the next room that they remained hidden and silent until morning. One of the boys, Justin, would later provide a crucial but deeply contested eyewitness account, claiming he had seen Sue arguing with 2 men earlier that night. The investigation quickly zeroed in on 2 primary suspects, both of whom were known to the Sharp family. The first was Martin Smart, a neighbor who lived in a nearby cabin. Smart's wife, Marilyn, told investigators that he had developed a deep-seated hatred for John Sharp and that he had been at a local bar with his friend that night. She also revealed a chilling detail. A hammer, similar to one found at the scene, had mysteriously gone missing from their home. Smart himself would later allegedly confess to his therapist that he was responsible for Sue Sharp's passing, but not the others. The second main suspect was Martin Smart's friend, John Bo Bobu, an ex-convict from Chicago with reported ties to organized crime. Bobu was staying with Smart in Keddie at the time of the events, and the 2 men had left town together shortly after. A composite sketch was later created, based on the memories of the young witness Justin, and it bore a striking resemblance to Martin Smart. But for years, this and other leads were not properly pursued by the authorities. The list of investigative failures is long and frustrating. A cryptic phone call, made from a payphone in the nearby town of Feather Falls, and later determined to have been made by Tina Sharp after her abduction, was recorded but not properly investigated at the time. A letter Martin Smart wrote to his wife shortly after the event, which read, "I've paid the price of your love, and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives," was held as evidence but did not lead to an arrest. For 3 agonizing years, the fate of Tina Sharp remained unknown. Then, in 1984, an anonymous caller directed the Butte County Sheriff's Office to a remote location nearly 30 miles from Keddie, a place known as Camp 18. There, a portion of a human skull and a jawbone were discovered, and through dental records, they were positively identified as the remains of Tina Sharp. The call that led to her discovery was later traced back to a payphone outside a mental health facility, and it's believed the caller may have been Martin Smart himself. The case went cold for decades, a source of pain and rumor in the small community. It was only in the 2010s, with a new sheriff in charge, that the case was officially reopened. In 2016, a hammer matching the description of the one Martin Smart had owned was recovered from a local pond, and modern investigators, reviewing the old files, have stated they are confident that Smart and Bobedy were the primary perpetrators, but as both men are now deceased, a definitive legal conclusion is impossible. The Keddie Cabin murders remain a dark stain on the history of the Sierra Nevadas, a story of horrific violence compounded by a profoundly flawed investigation. While the identities of the perpetrators seem likely, the case remains officially unsolved. The deeper mystery is not just who committed the act, but what the specific motive was for such a targeted event, and how a crime of such magnitude could be so thoroughly mishandled, leaving a community with only questions and ghosts. The Money Pit of Oak Island. Off the rugged coast of Nova Scotia, Canada, lies a small, windswept and seemingly unremarkable piece of land, the 40-acre Oak Island. Yet, for over 2 centuries, this island has been the epicenter of one of the world's greatest and most frustrating treasure hunts, a relentless, multi-generational obsession that has consumed fortunes, baffled engineers, and even claimed lives. It is the story of a mysterious hole in the ground, known as the Money Pit, and the belief that it leads to a priceless treasure, protected by an ancient and ingenious booby trap. The legend begins in the summer of 1795, when a teenager named Daniel McGinnis was exploring the island and noticed something peculiar. In a clearing, he found a circular depression in the ground, about 13 feet in diameter. Directly above it, a thick branch on a large oak tree had been sawn off and showed signs of severe scarring, as if a rope and pulley system, a block and tackle, had been used to lower something heavy into the vein below. Intrigued, McGinnis returned with 2 friends, John Smith and Anthony Vaughan, and they began to dig. Just 2 feet below the surface, they hit a solid layer of flagstones, a clear sign that this was a man-made structure. Encouraged, they removed the stones and continued digging. At a depth of 10 feet, their shovels struck solid wood. It was a platform of thick, oak logs, laid tightly across the entire shaft. This was no ordinary hole, it was a carefully constructed pit. The boys continued their dig, and they found the same thing at 20 feet, and again at 30 feet, a platform of oak logs at every 10-foot interval. Realizing they were dealing with something far beyond their simple means, they abandoned their initial dig, but the story of their discovery began to spread, sparking a treasure hunt that continues to this day. Over the next few years, a formal syndicate called the Onslow Company was formed to properly excavate the shaft. As they dug deeper, the mystery intensified. They continued to find the oak log platforms at regular 10-foot intervals, but they also discovered layers of charcoal, putty, most bizarrely, coconut fiber, a material not native to the cold climate of Nova Scotia, suggesting it had been brought from a tropical location far away. At a depth of 90 feet, they unearthed the most legendary and controversial clue in the island's history, a large stone tablet covered in a series of strange cryptic symbols. According to an early and highly debated account, a local professor was able to translate the inscription. It supposedly read, 40 feet below, 2 million pounds lie buried. This tantalizing message though the stone itself has been lost since the early 1900s, became the driving force for all who followed. It was just below this 90-foot mark that the creators of the pit revealed their true genius. As the excavators continued digging, their probe struck something hard, what they believed was a treasure chest. Elated, they retired for the evening, planning to retrieve their prize the next morning. But when they returned, they were met with a devastating desek. The entire shaft, over 90 feet deep, had flooded with seawater, almost to the very top. Their attempts to bail out the water were futile, as it poured in as fast as they could remove it. They had unknowingly sprung a brilliant and ancient booby trap. Further investigation would reveal an incredible feat of engineering, a complex system of man-made flood tunnels lined with rock and coconut fiber that connected the money pit to the nearby ocean at a place called Smith's Cove. The pit was designed to use the power of the Atlantic itself as its eternal guardian. For the next 200 years, the story of Oak Island became a cycle of hope, obsession, and failure. Dozens of treasure hunting syndicates, armed with ever more advanced technology, have tried to defeat the flood tunnels and reach the bottom of the pit. They have used massive steam-powered pumps, built cofferdams to hold back the sea, and drilled numerous exploratory boreholes, transforming the island's landscape into a pockmarked maze of shafts and trenches. The hunt has cost millions of dollars and, tragically, has claimed the lives of 6 men, feeding into a local legend that 7 people must perish before the island will give up its treasure. The central mystery has always been, who would have had the resources and the engineering know-how to build such a complex structure, and what could possibly be so valuable as to warrant this level of protection? The theories are as deep and as varied as the pit itself. The most romantic notions point to pirate treasure, that the pit is the lost vault of Captain Kidd, or the infamous Blackbeard, a theory that fits the era but perhaps not the scale of the engineering. Another, more esoteric theory suggests the pit is the hiding place for the lost treasure of the Knights Templar. It posits that after the suppression of their order in the 14th century, the Templars used their vast fleet to transport their sacred relics, perhaps even the Holy Grail, or the Ark of the Covenant, to the safety of the New World, and buried it in this elaborate vault. More grounded theories suggest a military purpose, that the pit was constructed by British or French forces during the colonial wars to hide a massive military payroll from the enemy, or that it is the hiding place for the lost crown jewels of France smuggled out of the country by loyalists during the French Revolution. Some have even suggested it is where Francis Bacon hid the original manuscripts, proving he was the true author of Shakespeare's plays. To this day, the Money Pit has held on to its secret. Modern-day treasure hunters, equipped with the latest technology, continue the search, finding small but tantalizing clues, like old coins, pieces of parchment, and strange metal objects. But the main treasure chamber remains elusive. Oak Island is a mystery that has become more about the relentless, hopeful, and often tragic nature of the hunt itself than the treasure, a 200-year-old question mark buried deep beneath the earth. The disappearance of the Yuba County Five. Some mysteries are defined by their complexity, by a web of suspects and motives, but others are haunting for their sheer, inexplicable strangeness, a series of events so bizarre and so contrary to human logic that they defy any rational explanation. In the winter of 5 young men from Yuba County, California, drove up a remote mountain road after a basketball game and into the heart of one of America's most perplexing and tragic unsolved cases. The 5 men, Gary Mathias, Jack Madruga, Jackie Huot, Ted Waher, and Bill Sterling, were a close-knit group of friends. They were all in their late 20s and early 30s, but were often known affectionately as the boys by their families, as they all had mild intellectual disabilities and shared a simple, happy life centered around their families, their jobs, and their passion for basketball. On the night of Friday, February 24th, 1978, their beloved local team, the UC Davis Aggies, were playing a road game in Chico, about an hour north of their homes in Yuba City. The 5 men, led by Jack Madruga, the only one with a driver's license and the proud owner of a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego, drove up to Chico to cheer on their team. After the game, they were seen stopping at a local convenience store just before 10 p.m., buying snacks and drinks for the ride home. It was the last time any of them were ever confirmed to be seen alive. They should have driven south, back down the highway to Yuba City, a straight and simple drive they had made before. But for reasons that remain completely unknown, they did not go home. Instead, their car traveled east for hours, climbing high into the Sierra Nevada mountains, into the deep woods and winding dirt roads of the Plumas National Forest. 4 days later, after a frantic search was launched, Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego was discovered by a park ranger. It was parked on a remote snow-covered logging road, far from any main highway, and at an altitude of 4,500 feet, a place they had absolutely no reason to be, especially in the dead of a winter night. The car itself only deepened the mystery. It was unlocked, and in perfect working order, with more than a quarter tank of gas left. It was stuck in a snowdrift, but not badly, and the 5 athletic young men could have easily pushed it free. Inside the car, the wrappers from the snacks and the empty cartons of milk they had bought in Chico were found, suggesting they had not been there for a very long time before abandoning the vehicle. There were no signs of a struggle or foul play. The car was a perfectly safe and functional shelter from the cold, but the men were gone, the keys were missing, and they had left the warmth of the car to venture on foot, deeper into the snowy, freezing wilderness. The discovery of the car kicked off a massive search, but it was hampered by a severe winter storm that buried the mountains in deep snow. For months, there were no new clues. The families of the 5 men could only wait, and one bot could have possibly made their sons drive up that remote mountain road. And why would they abandon a perfectly good car to walk into a blizzard? The heartbreaking answers began to emerge in early June, after the spring thaw had melted most of the snow. A group of motorcyclists discovered a Forest Service trailer, a small cabin-like structure used to house seasonal workers, nearly 20 miles from where the car had been found. When authorities broke down the door, they found the remains of Ted Weyer. He was lying on a bed, wrapped in 8 sheets, as if to fight off the intense cold. The scene inside the trailer was a bizarre tableau of survival and confusion. An autopsy showed that Weyer had survived for a significant amount of time after the disappearance, possibly as long as 8 to 13 weeks. He had lost nearly 100 pounds, and his feet were severely frostbitten. In the trailer, investigators found a locker full of canned sea rations, enough food to keep all 5 men alive for months, but only about a dozen of the cans had been opened. This detail was baffling. Why, in a state of starvation, would they only eat a tiny fraction of the food that was readily available? Furthermore, while a can opener could have been used, the cans were opened with a different tool. Even though sea rations are designed to be opened with an attached key, in a cabin full of wooden furniture and paperback books, with matches available, no fire had ever been started, a basic survival step that could have saved their lives. 2 days later, the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were found in the woods about 11 miles from the car. They had clearly perished from the elements many weeks earlier. Later, Jackie Hewitt's father, following a search party, found his son's backbone under a manzanita bush 2 miles from the trailer. His other remains were found nearby. The cause of their passing was exposure and starvation. But one man was still missing, Gary Mathias. His remains have never been found. A pair of his tennis shoes was found inside the Forest Service trailer, suggesting that Ted Weyer may have worn them, as his own shoes were too big for his frostbitten feet. Mathias had a history of schizophrenia, for which he was on medication, and this has led to speculation that he may have played a role in the group's strange and illogical decisions. But without his remains, his final fate is a complete unknown. The few clues that exist only add to the confusion. A man named Joseph Shons later came forward, claiming he had gotten his own car stuck in the snow. on the same mountain road on the night the men disappeared. While suffering a mild heart attack, he said he saw a group of men and what he thought was a woman holding a baby, walking up the road, and heard whistling. He called out for help, but they fell silent and turned off their flashlights. The timeline and location are a near-perfect match, but his sighting of a woman and baby has never been explained. In the end, there is no evidence of foul play, only a tragic and incomprehensible chain of events, where the 5 men confused, perhaps following the headlights of another car up the mountain, were they chased or frightened by someone, forcing them to abandon their car and flee into the woods. Why did they not use the abundant resources in the trailer that could have saved their lives? The answers, it seems, perished with the men in the cold silence of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The Flatwoods Monster. In the autumn of 1952, America was in the grip of a strange and pervasive fever. The Cold War was raging, the space race was dawning, and the skies themselves seemed to have become a theater for the unexplained. It was the era of the great UFO flap, a time when reports of flying saucers and strange aerial phenomena were a staple of newspapers and radio broadcasts. It is against this backdrop of high anxiety and cosmic wonder that one of the most terrifying and bizarre close encounter stories of all time would unfold, not in a major city, but in the tiny, quiet Appalachian town of Flatwoods, West Virginia. Our story begins on the evening of September 12, 1952. A group of young boys were playing football in the local schoolyard as twilight began to settle over the hills. Suddenly, their game was interrupted by a stunning sight. A bright, fiery, pulsating red object streaked across the sky. It appeared to slow down and then descend, seeming to come down on a nearby hilltop on the property of a local farmer named G. Bailey Fisher. Convinced they had just witnessed a flying saucer crash, the boys, led by brothers Ed and Freddie May, ran to their mother's home, the local beautician Kathleen May. Bursting in, they excitedly told her what they had seen. Intrigued and a little concerned, Kathleen agreed to accompany them to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight, and together with her 2 sons, 3 of the other boys, and a 17-year-old local named Gene Lemon, they set off for the Fisher farm. Lemon's dog ran ahead of the group, eager to explore. As the small party of 7 made their way up the dark, wooded hill, a strange and unsettling atmosphere began to descend. They noticed a peculiar, thick mist clinging to the ground, a fog that carried a sickeningly sweet, metallic odor that made their eyes and throats burn. A moment later, they heard the dog bark ferociously, and then let out a yelp before running back past them with its tail between its legs, terrified of something in the darkness ahead. Shaken but determined, they pressed on towards the top of the hill. There they saw a large spherical object, a pulsating red ball of light about 50 feet to their right, and they heard a strange, high-pitched hissing or whirring sound. It was then that Gene Lemon, at the front of the group, saw 2 smaller, faint lights in the shadows under a large oak tree. Thinking they were the eyes of an animal, he swung the beam of his flashlight towards them. The sight that the flashlight beam revealed would sear itself into their memories and become a cornerstone of American monster lore. Staring back at them was a terrifying figure, a towering entity at least 10 feet tall, with a body that was dark and seemingly shapeless. It was the creature's head that was most distinct. It was shaped like the ace of spades, and from within this strange, hood-like cowl, 2 enormous, non-human eyes glowed with a greenish-orange light. The creature appeared to have small, claw-like hands, and its lower body was described as a dark, pleated skirt or gown. It seemed to hover or float just above the ground. The group was paralyzed by fear for only a moment, as the creature let out a chilling hiss and began to glide towards them. Their terror broke, and they turned and fled in a state of pure, primal panic. They ran down the hill, never looking back, not stopping until they reached the safety of the May home. From there, they immediately contacted the local sheriff and a newspaper reporter. The journalist, a man named A., Lee Stewart Jr., and the sheriff arrived to investigate that same night. While they found no sign of the creature, they both reported that the strange, burnt, metallic odor was still lingering in the air on the hilltop. They also discovered 2 long skid marks and a strange, gummy deposit on the ground, but no other physical trace of a crashed object or a monstrous being. In the hours and days that followed, many of the witnesses suffered from nausea, vomiting, and irritation to their throats and noses, symptoms they attributed to the strange mists they had encountered on the hill. The story was picked up by the national press, and the Flatwoods Monster, as it was quickly nicknamed, became a media sensation. The U.S. Air Force's official UFO investigation, Project Blue Book, looked into the case, but the mystery of what the 7 witnesses truly saw that night has never been definitively solved. The leading skeptical explanation, proposed by investigators like Joe Nickell, is that the entire event was a case of misidentification, amplified by excitement and fear. The streaking red light that started it all was most likely a meteor, a common sight in the night sky. The theory posits that the group, already in a heightened state of anticipation after seeing the crash, then misinterpreted a large barn owl perched on a tree branch. In this scenario, the owl's silhouette, perched on a limb, could have created the ace of spades head shape. Its large round eyes would have reflected the flashlight beam, appearing to glow with an unearthly light. The tree trunk below it would have seemed like the creature's body, and the hissing was simply the defensive sound of an agitated owl. The witnesses have always vehemently denied this explanation, insisting that what they saw was far larger, far more terrifying, and in no way resembled a bird. Another theory points to mass hysteria. The UFO craze of the 1950s had primed the public, especially young people, to see flying saucers and aliens. The initial excitement of the crash could have put the group in a highly suggestible state, and in the darkness of a spooky remote hilltop, their collective fear and imagination could have transformed a mundane sight into a terrifying monster. The Flatwoods Monster was a fleeting visitor. It appeared for only a few moments on a single night and was never seen again. Was it a genuine alien being, its landing witnessed by a group of terrified locals? Or was it a simple barn owl, transformed into a terrifying monster by the power of fear and suggestion in the dark woods of West Virginia? The memory of the 10-foot-tall creature with the glowing red eyes has become an iconic piece of American folklore, a story that perfectly captures the paranoid, saucer-crazed atmosphere of the 1950s. The unexplained death of Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe was the undisputed master of the macabre, the father of the modern detective story, and a poet whose dark and beautiful verses still echo through the halls of literature. He was a man who created worlds of mystery and suspense, a mind that invented the brilliant detective C. Auguste Dupin, a character who could solve any puzzle with the power of pure logic. It is a profound and tragic irony, then, that the man who perfected the mystery story would leave behind one of his own, a final, baffling chapter that remains unsolved to this day, the bizarre and inexplicable circumstances of his own demise. The story begins in late September of 1849. Poe, who had struggled for years with poverty and personal tragedy, seemed to be on the verge of a new and happy chapter in his life. He had recently reconnected with his childhood sweetheart, Sarah Elmira Royster, who was now a wealthy widow, and they were engaged to be married. He had also recently joined a temperance society, pledging to abstain from alcohol, a substance that had been a destructive force throughout his life. On September 27th, he left Richmond, Virginia, on a steamer, intending to travel to his home in New York City to settle his affairs and prepare for his wedding. He was reportedly in good spirits and looked healthy, but he never arrived in New York. For 5 to 6 days, Edgar Allan Poe, one of the most famous writers in America, completely vanished. His whereabouts during this time are a total blank in the historical record. He resurfaced on October 3rd on the streets of Baltimore, a city he was only meant to be passing through. A printer for the Baltimore Sun, named Joseph Bedbieux Walker, discovered Poe outside a public house called Gunners Hall. which was being used that day as a polling place for a local election. The great writer was in a state of profound distress. He was described as being semi-conscious, delirious, and dressed in cheap, ill-fitting, and soiled clothes that were clearly not his own. His own fine wool suit was missing. Walker, recognizing the famous author, sent an urgent note to one of Poe's acquaintances, an editor named Dr. Joseph A. Snodgrass. The note read, "There is a gentleman, rather the worse for wear, at Ryan's Fourth Ward polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar and who appears in great distress, and he says he is acquainted with you, and I assure you, he is in need of immediate assistance." Poe was taken to the Washington College Hospital, where he was placed under the care of Dr. John Moran. For the next 4 days, Poe drifted in and out of consciousness, never once becoming lucid enough to explain what had happened to him during his missing days. He was plagued by vivid hallucinations, speaking to spectral figures on the walls, and his periods of coherence were brief and filled with confusion. On the night before his passing, he reportedly began to repeatedly call out the name, though the identity of this person has never been determined. On the morning of October 7th, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe passed away at the age of 40. The official cause was listed on his death certificate as phrenitis, or congestion of the brain. Vague, 19th century terms that were often used as catch-alls when a doctor did not know the true cause of a person's demise. The mystery of his final days had begun. The traditional theory, and the one that has stained his reputation for over a century, is that he perished from a relapse into alcoholism. This narrative was aggressively promoted by his literary rival, Rufus Griswold, who wrote a scathing and largely fabricated obituary that painted Poe as a depraved and drunken madman. This theory suggests Poe simply abandoned his journey, went on a multi-day binge, and succumbed to alcohol poisoning. But Dr. Moran, the attending physician, repeatedly stated that Poe showed none of the usual signs of a person in the final stages of such a condition. A more compelling and widely supported theory points to the dark political realities of 19th century Baltimore. The practice of cooping was a brutal form of election fraud, where gangs, hired by political parties, would kidnap an unsuspecting person off the street. They would then ply the victim with alcohol or drugs, often beat them, and then drag them, sometimes in disguise, to multiple polling stations to vote repeatedly for a chosen candidate. This theory would neatly explain all the strange circumstances: his delirious state, his location at a polling place on election day, and the cheap, strange clothes he was found wearing. Another, simpler explanation is that Poe was merely the victim of a violent robbery. He could have been mugged, beaten, stripped of his expensive suit and money, and left for dead in the clothes of his attacker. The trauma from such an event could have easily induced the state of delirium in which he was found, and the lack of a police report from that era makes this a very plausible, if mundane, explanation. In the years since, medical experts have proposed a host of retrospective diagnoses. His symptoms are remarkably consistent with the final stages of rabies, which would have been untreatable at the time. Other possibilities include a brain tumor, advanced syphilis, or even carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty gas lamp, any of which could account for his sudden and severe neurological distress. In the end, the passing of Edgar Allan Poe is a mystery worthy of his own pen. The hospital records have been lost, the key witnesses have long since passed away, and the historical record was intentionally poisoned by his greatest rival. Was he a victim of his own famous vices, a casualty of the violent political corruption of his time, or a man struck down by a sudden and virulent illness? The master of mystery left behind one final, perfect puzzle: his own unexplained end. The mystery of the Shroud of Turin. In a climate-controlled, bulletproof case in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, lies arguably the most famous and controversial religious relic in the world. It is a 14-foot-long, sepia-toned linen cloth, and on its surface is the faint, ghostly, full-body image of a man, front and back. who appears to have suffered the precise injuries associated with a crucifixion. For millions of devout believers, this is the sacred burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth, a miraculous image created in the moment of his resurrection. For skeptical scientists, it is the most ingenious and enduring forgery ever created. This is the profound mystery of the Shroud of Turin. The image on the cloth is both faint and incredibly detailed. It shows a bearded, muscular man with long hair, his hands crossed over his midsection. The image bears markings that are strikingly consistent with the biblical accounts of the Passion of Christ. There are wounds on the wrists and feet, consistent with large nails, a wound in the side, consistent with a spear, and dozens of small, dumbbell-shaped marks across the back and shoulders, consistent with a Roman-style flogging. There are also circular marks on the scalp, which many interpret as injuries from a crown of thorns. For centuries, the shroud was revered as a powerful, if mysterious icon, but the true enigma of the image was not revealed until the year 1898. An amateur Italian photographer named Secondo Pia was given permission to take the first ever photographs of the relic. As he developed the glass plate negatives in his darkroom, he was stunned by what he saw. The faint, ethereal image on the cloth was in fact a perfect photographic negative. His photographic plate, which should have been a negative, instead revealed a stunningly detailed, lifelike, and natural-looking positive image of a man's face and body, a portrait of serene suffering that was far more detailed than what was visible to the naked eye. This discovery transformed the shroud from a simple object of faith into a profound scientific puzzle. How could a medieval artist, centuries before the invention of photography, have created a perfect, full-body photographic negative? The shroud's known, verifiable history begins in the 1350s in the small town of Léry, France, where it was put on public display by a French knight named Geoffroy de Charny. From its very first appearance, its authenticity was a matter of intense debate. A local bishop, Pierre d'Arcy, wrote a formal letter to the Pope in 1389, denouncing the shroud as a fraud. He claimed it was cunningly painted, and that he had even spoken to the artist who had made it, though he never revealed a name. From France, the shroud passed into the hands of the powerful House of Savoy, who eventually brought it to Turin, where it has remained for over 400 years. The modern scientific investigation of the shroud reached its peak in 1978, with the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP. A team of respected American scientists from various fields were given unprecedented, round-the-clock access to the cloth for 5 days. Their goal was to finally answer the question of how the image was formed. Their findings were baffling. They concluded, definitively, that the image was not the product of any paint, dye, powder, or other pigment. There were no brush strokes, no directionality, and the color was confined to the very topmost microfibers of the linen, a depth of less than a human hair. The STURP team also analyzed the reddish marks that appeared to be stains from the wounds. They concluded that these marks contained real human blood, specifically hemoglobin and albumin. Later tests would suggest the blood type was AB. Their final report was a study in ambiguity. They could explain what the image was not, but they could not explain what it was. They theorized it was the result of some unknown scorch-like process that had rapidly dehydrated and oxidized the linen fibers, but they could not replicate the process or propose a natural mechanism that could have created such a detailed, high-resolution negative image. The single greatest piece of scientific evidence against the shroud's authenticity came 10 years later, in 1988. The Vatican authorized a small sample of the cloth to be cut from a corner and sent to 3 of the world's most prestigious laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona for independent radiocarbon dating. The results were unambiguous. All 3 labs dated the linen cloth to a period between 1260 and 1390 AD, a perfect match for the time it first appeared in the historical record in France. For most of the scientific community, this was definitive proof. The Shroud of Turin was a medieval object, a brilliant and mysterious forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. For believers, however, the debate was far from over. They have argued for years that the single sample taken for the test was from a corner of the shroud that had been expertly repaired by medieval nuns after a fire, and that the newer, patched material had skewed the results. They also argue that centuries of handling and contamination from fire and smoke could have added new carbon to the cloth, making it appear younger than it is. And they always return to the central, unanswered question: if the shroud is a medieval forgery, how, exactly, was it made? To this day, no one has been able to successfully replicate all of its unique properties. A perfect, full-body, three-dimensional photographic negative image encoded on only the topmost fibers of a linen cloth, with no pigments, created centuries before the concept of photography was ever imagined. The Shroud of Turin remains at a fascinating and volatile crossroads between faith, science, and history. Is it a miraculously preserved image, a divine photograph, created by an inexplicable event at the dawn of Christianity, or is it the masterwork of an unknown medieval genius, an artist who created a forgery so sophisticated that it continues to baffle our most advanced 21st century science? The linen cloth rests silently in its case, a ghostly, silent image that asks each viewer to decide for themselves what they believe. The Lost Franklin Expedition. In the middle of the 19th century, at the absolute zenith of its global power, the British Empire was obsessed with one of the last great puzzles of world exploration: the discovery of the fabled Northwest Passage, a sea route that could connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the icy, labyrinthine archipelago of the Canadian Arctic. In 1845, the Royal Navy dispatched the most technologically advanced, best equipped, and most experienced polar expedition in history to finally conquer this final frontier. It was a mission considered a guaranteed success, a victory lap for an empire that believed it could tame any corner of the globe. The expedition was led by a veteran, if somewhat aging, polar explorer named Sir John Franklin, and it consisted of two massive, reinforced warships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. These were not simple wooden vessels. They were floating marvels of Victorian engineering, their hulls strengthened with iron plates to withstand the crushing ice, and they were fitted with auxiliary steam engines and propellers. They carried a crew of 29 elite officers and men, and they were provisioned with enough food, including over 8,000 tins of canned goods, to last for at least 3 years. In July of 1845, 2 whaling ships saw the Erebus and Terror in Baffin Bay, waiting for the right conditions to enter the ice-choked channels of the passage. It was the last time any of them were ever seen by Europeans again. After 2 years of complete silence, a nervous public, spurred on by Franklin's determined wife, Lady Jane Franklin, began to demand answers. The British Admiralty, initially unconcerned, eventually launched one of the largest search and rescue operations in history. For over a decade, dozens of ships from Britain and America scoured the Arctic, a massive and expensive effort that, while failing to find Franklin, succeeded in mapping vast, previously unknown regions of the North. The first real clues to the expedition's fate came not from the Royal Navy, but from the Inuit people who called the Arctic their home. In 1854, a Scottish explorer named John Ray was surveying the Boothia Peninsula when he encountered a group of Inuit hunters. They told him a story that sent a shockwave through Victorian England. They spoke of seeing a group of about 40 desperate, starving white men dragging a large boat south across the ice several years earlier. Later, they had found the men's final grim campsite. Most disturbingly, the Inuit described cut marks on the bones and the contents of the cooking pots, clear evidence that the final, desperate survivors of the world's most advanced polar expedition had resorted to the ultimate taboo to stay alive. When John Ray's report, with its stark evidence of cannibalism, reached England, it was met with outrage and disbelief. The establishment, including famous figures like the author Charles Dickens, refused to believe that civilized British naval officers could resort to such a savage act, and they instead blamed the Inuit, a racist and convenient dismissal of the truth. The only written record ever found from the expedition itself was discovered in 1859, inside a stone cairn at a place called Victory Point, on the desolate shores of King William Island. It was a single, pre-printed Admiralty form, and in its margins were two different messages. The first, dated May 1847, was cheerful and routine. It stated that the Erebus and Terror had been trapped in the ice since September of 1846, but that Sir John Franklin was still in command, and that all was well. But a second, far grimmer message had been scrawled in the margins a year later, in April of 18. This new message, written by Captain Francis Crozier, stated that the ships had been beset in the ice for a year and a half. It reported that Sir John Franklin had passed away on June 11th, 1847, and that the surviving 105 men had abandoned the ships and were attempting a desperate march south towards the Back River on the Canadian mainland. This single piece of paper, with its two conflicting messages, was the only voice that ever emerged from the lost expedition. For over 150 years, the story remained there, a grim tale of a doomed march. But the central mystery was, what had gone so wrong? Why did such a well-equipped expedition fail so catastrophically? A crucial clue emerged from modern scientific analysis of the few remains of the crew that were found on King William Island. The bones showed extremely high concentrations of lead. This has led to the leading modern theory that the crew was suffering from severe, debilitating lead poisoning. It is believed that the expedition's 8,000 canned food tins, a new technology at the time, were improperly and sloppily sealed with lead solder, which then leached into the food. This slow poisoning would have ravaged the crew, causing severe physical weakness, neurological damage, confusion, and paranoia. It would have rendered them incapable of making rational decisions and fighting for their own survival. Their fate was likely sealed, not by the ice, but by the very provisions that were meant to keep them alive. The final chapter of the mystery is being written right now, in 2014, and then again in 2016. Archaeological survey teams, guided by the long-dismissed oral histories of the Inuit people, made a stunning discovery. They found the wrecks of both the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror sitting silently on the seabed of the Canadian Arctic, in a remarkable state of preservation due to the freezing cold water. They were found almost exactly where Inuit testimony had said they would be for over a century. The mystery of the Franklin expedition is no longer a question of if the men perished, but of the specific, agonizing details of how and why. The discovery of the two ships has opened a new and exciting chapter in the story, promising answers that may lie sealed within their frozen hulls. It is a haunting story of imperial ambition, colliding with the unforgiving power of nature, a tale of a slow, grim demise brought on by tainted food, and a powerful testament to the endurance of Inuit oral history, which held the key to the mystery all along. The identity of Jack the Ripper. In the autumn of 1888, the city of London was the heart of a vast global empire, a beacon of progress and industry, but in its eastern quarter, in the district of Whitechapel, a different reality existed. It was a labyrinth of dark, gaslit alleyways, overcrowded slums, and profound poverty, a place of desperation and shadow. It was from these shadows that a figure would emerge, a phantom who, over the course of 10 terrifying weeks, would become the subject of the most famous unsolved crime spree in history. This is the enduring mystery of the individual known to the world as Jack the Ripper. The events took place in a concentrated period between August and November of 1888. The 5 women generally accepted as the canonical victims of this perpetrator, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Edola, and Mary Jane Kelly, were all residents of this desperate corner of London. They were women living in extreme poverty, forced into a dangerous life on the streets to survive. Their vulnerability made them easy targets for the faceless assailant who stalked the night. The pattern of the events quickly established a terrifying signature. The acts took place late at night or in the early morning hours, in secluded courtyards and dark corners, where a person could vanish from sight. What truly horrified the public and baffled the police was the nature of the injuries inflicted upon the women. The perpetrators' methods showed a clear and terrifying escalation, and the precise internal injuries on some of the individuals suggested a person who possessed a significant degree of anatomical knowledge, a detail that led to widespread speculation that the man could be a doctor or a surgeon. The Whitechapel district was thrown into a state of absolute panic. A massive police investigation was launched, with officers conducting house-to-house inquiries and interviewing thousands of residents, but they were overwhelmed. The perpetrator left behind almost no clues and seemed to melt back into the city's teeming population after each act. The burgeoning, sensationalist press of the era fanned the flames of fear, publishing graphic details and speculative theories that turned the Whitechapel fiend into a terrifying, almost supernatural figure. It was through this media frenzy that the perpetrator was given his iconic name. The police and local news agencies were inundated with hundreds of letters from people claiming to be the person responsible. The vast majority of these were quickly dismissed as cruel hoaxes, but 3 documents have become central to the Ripper legend. The first was the Dear Boss letter, a taunting message sent to the Central News Agency, in which the author mocked the police and, for the first time, signed off with the chilling moniker, Jack the Ripper. This name, so catchy and so sinister, was immediately adopted by the press and the public. This was followed by the Saucy Jackie postcard, which referenced 2 of the events and seemed to continue the taunting tone. For a long time, these 2 documents were believed to be authentic, but most modern experts now believe they were a journalistic fabrication, a hoax created by a reporter to keep the sensational story alive. Third and most disturbing letter, however, is considered by many to be genuine, known as the From Hell letter. It was sent to the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, George Lusk. It was a semi-literate and deeply menacing message, but it was what accompanied the letter that gave it its terrifying credibility. It arrived in a small box containing a preserved portion of a human kidney. The letter's author claimed to have taken it from one of the victims, an assertion that was consistent with the medical reports of the time. This grim package remains the only piece of potential physical evidence ever sent by the perpetrator. After the final devastating event in November of 1888, the string of related acts abruptly stopped. The perpetrator, whoever he was, simply vanished, leaving behind an endless and obsessive whodunit that has continued for over 130 years. The list of potential suspects is vast, but a few have remained at the center of the investigation for decades. One of the prime suspects, favored by the police at the time, was a man named Montague John Druitt, a barrister and school teacher from a good family who had fallen into disgrace. He took his own life shortly after the final event, and the timing, along with alleged suspicions from his own family, made him a compelling candidate in the eyes of the lead investigators, who believed the perpetrator had either passed away or been institutionalized after November 8. Another of the main suspects was a Polish immigrant named Aaron Kosminski, who worked as a hairdresser in Whitechapel. He had a known history of severe mental illness and a documented hatred of women, and he was institutionalized in an asylum around the time the events ceased. In recent years, a controversial and highly debated DNA analysis of a shawl said to have been recovered from one of the crime scenes has allegedly pointed to Kosminski's descendants, but the authenticity of the shawl and the validity of the DNA evidence are fiercely contested. A third prominent suspect, favored by the lead investigator, Frederick Aberline, was another Polish immigrant named Soren Klosowski, who used the alias George Chapman. Chapman was a convicted perpetrator who had ended the lives of 3 of his own wives using poison, and he possessed some medical training. While his methods were different, his known history of extreme violence towards women made him a person of great interest. The theories extend far beyond these 3, encompassing a vast cast of characters from all walks of life. from doctors and artists to common criminals and religious fanatics. Some have even proposed a Jill the Ripper theory, suggesting the perpetrator could have been a woman, perhaps a local midwife, who would have been able to move through the streets at night, covered in the evidence of her work, without arousing suspicion. In the end, Jack the Ripper was a perfect storm, a terrifying assailant, a new era of sensationalist media, and a police force struggling to cope with a new kind of anonymous urban crime. The files on the case have never been officially closed, and the identity of the person who held a city in the grip of fear remains the greatest secret of London's dark and foggy past. The vanishing of Flight 9. In the aftermath of the Second World War, America was a nation brimming with confidence, a country that had mastered the skies and the seas with its advanced technology and skilled personnel. It was in this atmosphere of can-do certainty that an event occurred that would challenge this modern sense of security and give birth to one of the most enduring legends of the 20th century, a mystery that would draw a dark, triangular shape on the map of the world's oceans. This is the story of Flight 9. Our story begins on the afternoon of December 5, 1945, at the Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. 5 U.S. Navy Avenger torpedo bombers, a powerful and reliable aircraft of the era, were preparing for a routine, over-water navigation and combat training exercise. The mission, designated Navigation Problem Number 1, was a simple triangular flight path, east from the Florida coast, north for a stretch, and then southwest back to the base, a route flown hundreds of times before. The squadron of 5 planes and 14 airmen was led by an experienced combat pilot and flight instructor, Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor. He was a veteran of the Pacific Theater, a capable leader, but on this particular day, 2 details would later prove to be critically important. He had only recently been transferred to Fort Lauderdale from Miami and was less familiar with the local geography, and according to some reports, he had tried to be excused from this specific flight, but was ordered to go. At 2:10 p.m., under clear skies and with good visibility, Flight 19 took off and headed east over the Atlantic. For the first hour and a half, everything was perfectly normal. Then, at around 3:45 p.m., the control tower at Fort Lauderdale picked up a stunning and unexpected transmission. It was Lieutenant Taylor, and he sounded confused and anxious. "Both of my compasses are out, and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale," he reported. "I am over land, but it's broken. I'm sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down." This was the first indication that something was terribly wrong. The flight should have been well east of the Florida Peninsula, over the ocean, with no land in sight, and the Florida Keys were hundreds of miles to the south of their actual position. The air traffic controllers, realizing Taylor was disoriented, tried to guide him, but a strange and fatal communication breakdown was occurring. Taylor seemed convinced of his incorrect position, and his past experience flying out of Miami may have reinforced this false belief. The radio transmissions over the next 2 hours, both from Taylor and from the other pilots in his squadron, paint a chilling picture of escalating confusion. The tower repeatedly told him to fly west, towards the setting sun, which would have brought him back to the Florida coast. But Taylor, believing he was in the Gulf of Mexico, instead led his squadron further northeast, deeper into the vast, empty expanse of the Atlantic. Other pilots in the squadron could be heard on the radio, questioning their leader's judgment. One pilot transmitted, "If we would just fly west, we would get home." But military discipline prevailed, and they continued to follow their commander's lead. As time wore on, the weather, which had been clear, began to deteriorate. The seas grew rough, the winds picked up, and the sun began to set, making a water landing, known as ditching, an increasingly dangerous prospect. As their fuel ran critically low, Taylor's transmissions became more fragmented. He was heard making a final, fateful decision. "All planes close up tight," he ordered. "We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." After that, the radio signals faded into static. The 5 Avenger bombers and their 14 crewmen had vanished. The tragedy was then compounded by a second disappearance. As part of the massive air and sea search that was immediately launched, a PBM Martin Mariner flying boat with a crew of 13 men was dispatched to search for the missing squadron. These massive planes had a grim nickname, flying gas tanks, due to a known tendency for fuel vapor leaks to create a fire hazard. At 7:50 p.m., the Mariner sent a routine radio message and was never heard from again. It too had vanished from radar, but its fate was not a mystery for long. A nearby ship, the SS Gaines Mills, reported seeing a massive fireball in the sky, a huge explosion at the exact time and location where the Mariner would have been, followed by a burning oil slick on the water. It was almost certain that the rescue plane itself had suffered a catastrophic accident, adding another 13 souls to the night's terrible toll. For 5 days, one of the largest searches in naval history combed the Atlantic, but they found absolutely no trace of Flight 19. No wreckage, no lifeboats, no oil slick, no sign of the 14 airmen. The official US Navy report concluded that the incident was the result of pilot disorientation, that Lieutenant Taylor, confused by his malfunctioning compasses and his mistaken belief that he was over the Florida Keys, had led his squadron in the wrong direction until they all ran out of fuel and perished in the stormy sea. But this logical, human error explanation was not enough for a public captivated by the sheer scale of the disappearance. The idea of 5 military planes and then a rescue plane, all vanishing in the same area on the same night, seemed to demand a more extraordinary explanation. This event, more than any other, became the foundational legend of the Bermuda Triangle, a supposedly paranormal region of the ocean where ships and planes are said to disappear under mysterious circumstances. Proponents of this theory claim the squadron entered an electronic fog or a space-time anomaly that caused their instruments to fail and led to their disappearance. In the end, the vanishing of Flight 19 is a story of how a tragic but likely explainable event can transform into a powerful, enduring myth. The combination of 5 planes disappearing at once, compounded by the loss of the rescue plane, created a perfect storm for legend making. Was it a simple case of a disoriented pilot leading his men to a tragic end in a stormy sea? Or was it the first great casualty of the mysterious forces that are said to haunt the stretch of ocean known as the Bermuda Triangle? The 5 planes and their crews never return, flying instead into the pages of modern folklore. The enigma of ball lightning. A thunderstorm is a display of nature's raw and familiar power. The brilliant flash of lightning and the resounding crack of thunder are phenomena we have understood for centuries. But hidden within the heart of the storm is another, far stranger and more elusive event, a phenomenon that has been reported by credible witnesses for thousands of years, yet continues to exist on the very fringes of scientific explanation. It is a beautiful, terrifying, and almost ghostly enigma, known as ball lightning. For those who have seen it, the experience is unforgettable. Eyewitness accounts, gathered from across the globe and spanning centuries, paint a remarkably consistent picture of a truly bizarre object. Ball lightning typically appears during a thunderstorm as a luminous, glowing sphere, ranging in size from a small golf ball to a large beach ball. It can be almost any color, but is most often described as white, yellow, or a fiery orange-red. What makes ball lightning so profoundly strange is its behavior. Unlike a normal lightning strike, which is an instantaneous flash, a ball lightning event can last for many seconds, sometimes even minutes. It does not streak across the sky, but moves with a strange, almost curious deliberation. It has been seen to hover silently in mid-air, drift slowly against the wind, and perform erratic, zigzagging maneuvers, as if it were a living thing, exploring its environment. The most physics-defying and baffling aspect of the phenomenon is its reported ability to interact with solid objects. There are hundreds of credible accounts, from naval officers to commercial airline pilots, of ball lightning passing directly through solid glass windows without leaving a mark. It has been seen to drift through closed wooden doors, squeeze through tiny keyholes, and even pass through the metal fuselages of airplanes, a feat that should be impossible for a hot ball of plasma. After its strange and silent dance, the event typically ends in one of two ways. It either dissipates quietly, fading into nothingness, or it vanishes with a sudden loud pop or a violent bang, often leaving behind the distinct, sharp smell of ozone or sulfur, a final, lingering trace of its mysterious presence. Reports of these strange, fiery balls are not a modern phenomenon. They go back to antiquity. The ancient Greeks wrote of strange, glowing spheres descending from the sky during storms. In the 18th, a physicist named George Richman was reportedly ended by what is believed to have been a ball lightning event, when a large pale blue sphere traveled down the wire of his experimental apparatus and exploded in his face. For centuries, mainstream science dismissed the phenomenon entirely. The lack of physical evidence and the sheer strangeness of the reports led most scientists to believe that ball lightning was nothing more than an optical illusion, a retinal afterimage left by a bright flash of normal lightning, or perhaps even a neurological event, like a hallucination. But the sheer volume of consistent and credible eyewitness reports, many from trained observers like scientists and pilots, has slowly forced science to take the enigma seriously. Today, ball lightning is accepted as a real, albeit rare and poorly understood, natural phenomenon. The central challenge is that its fleeting and unpredictable nature makes it almost impossible to study in a controlled way. In the absence of definitive data, a number of compelling scientific theories have been proposed to explain what it could be. The leading modern theory is the vaporized silicon hypothesis. This theory suggests that when a conventional lightning bolt strikes the ground, the intense heat can instantly vaporize silica and other minerals in the soil, creating a cloud of tiny airborne silicon nanoparticles. This cloud of silicon vapor then begins to slowly oxidize or burn in the air, and this slow chemical reaction is what produces the glowing floating sphere of light. This theory elegantly explains the ball's slow movement, its long duration, and its ability to float, but it struggles to account for its most bizarre reported behavior, like its ability to pass through solid walls and windows. A cloud of burning dirt, no matter how exotic, should not be able to do that. Other theories point to more exotic physics. One model suggests that ball lightning is a bubble of hot, ionized gas, or plasma, held together by its own powerful self-generated magnetic fields. The main problem with this idea is that such a bubble should be incredibly hot and should rise very quickly, like a hot air balloon, which contradicts the many reports of slow drifting, seemingly cool spheres. A more complex theory involves atmospheric masers, which are naturally occurring microwave lasers that can be generated during a thunderstorm. It has been proposed that this intense microwave energy could become trapped inside a small bubble of plasma, creating a stable self-contained object known as a soliton, which could, in theory, pass through solid materials like glass. In the end, ball lightning remains a genuine and fascinating scientific mystery. It is a phenomenon that has been witnessed by thousands of credible people for millennia, yet it is so rare and so fleeting that it has defied easy capture and definitive explanation. Is it a cloud of burning earth, a bubble of exotic plasma, or something else entirely? It represents a beautiful and tantalizing gap in our understanding of the very atmosphere we live in, a silent and sometimes explosive ghost that appears in the heart of the storm. The Maine Penny. The story of the discovery of the Americas is a cornerstone of modern history, a simple tale of three ships, a determined Italian explorer named Christopher Columbus, and a fateful landing in the year 1492. But history is rarely so simple, and for decades evidence has been growing that others had made the treacherous journey across the Atlantic long before him. The most famous of these are the Vikings, whose settlement at Lancer Meadows in Newfoundland proves they reached North America around the year 1000. But a single tiny and out-of-place artifact found buried in the soil of coastal Maine suggests their journey, or at least their influence. may have extended far further than we ever imagined. Our story is centered on the Goddard site, a sprawling and significant Native American archaeological site in the town of Brooklyn, Maine. For centuries, this location on Nuskai Point was a bustling coastal settlement and a major trading hub for the ancestors of the Penobscot people. In the 19th, the Memetar archaeologist named Guy Melgren began a patient and methodical excavation of the site. Over the years, he unearthed more than 30,000 artifacts, from stone tools to fragments of ancient pottery. In 1957, amongst these thousands of indigenous artifacts, Melgren found something small, thin, and out of place: a heavily corroded silver coin. At the time, he was unable to identify it and simply catalogued it with his other finds. For over 2 decades, the coin's true significance remained unknown. It wasn't until 1978 that a specialist from the American Numismatic Society examined the find, and the true, history-altering nature of the small piece of silver was revealed. Experts at the University of Oslo in Norway were consulted, and they gave a stunning confirmation. The coin was a genuine 11th century Norse penny. It was minted during the reign of King Olaf Kyrre, who ruled Norway between the years 1067 and 1093. It was an authentic Viking Age coin, a piece of medieval Scandinavia that had somehow found its way to a Native American trading post in Maine, a place it simply should not have been. This discovery is profoundly significant because it is the only pre-Columbian Norse artifact ever found in the United States that is widely considered to be genuine by the academic community. The archaeological context is key. The coin was found in a strata layer of the dig site that dates to between the years 1180 and 1235. Perfect timeline for an 11th century coin to have been in circulation and eventually lost. This means an object created in Norway around the year 1080 ended its journey buried in the soil of Maine nearly 500 years before Columbus was even born. The central mystery is not if Vikings were in North America, as the settlement at Lazo Meadows in Newfoundland has proven that conclusively. The question is, how did this specific coin travel more than 600 miles south from that known settlement to a native trading hub in Maine? This question has given rise to 3 competing theories. The first and most exciting possibility is that of direct contact. This theory suggests that Norse explorers, the legendary Vikings, did not just stop at Newfoundland, but continued to explore the coastline of the New World, sailing much further south. If this is true, the Maine penny could be the first definitive proof that Vikings landed and directly traded with the indigenous people of what is now the United States. The coin could have been a trade item, a gift, or simply been dropped by a Norse explorer standing on that very shore. The second, and more widely accepted theory among historians and archaeologists, is one of indirect trade. In this scenario, the coin began its journey at the Viking settlement in Newfoundland, where it was traded to a local northern tribe. From there it was passed from hand to hand, from tribe to tribe, down the vast and sophisticated Native American trade networks that existed all along the eastern seaboard for centuries. The Goddard site was a major hub on this network, and the coin's final resting place there would be a testament not to a Viking's journey, but to the incredible reach and interconnectedness of pre-Columbian native societies. Of course, with any out-of-place artifact, one must consider the possibility of a hoax. Some skeptics have suggested that the coin could have been a modern plant, deliberately placed at the site by its discoverer or someone else to create a sensational find. However, most experts have dismissed this possibility for several reasons. The coin's discovery was documented by Melgren years before its true, sensational nature was ever understood, and he never sought fame or fortune from it. The Goddard site is a legitimate, undisturbed archaeological find, and the coin's corrosion is consistent with it having been buried in that specific coastal soil for a very long time. In the end, the Maine penny is a quiet but powerful enigma. Unlike legendary ruins or cryptic texts, it is a small, solid, and scientifically verified fact. a piece of 11th century Norway found in a 12th century American settlement. Whether it was left there by a Viking explorer charting a new coast, or whether it arrived after a long and winding journey through a vast native trade network, its presence fundamentally rewrites the simple story of 1492. It is a tiny silver ghost that speaks of a much older, more complex and more interconnected history of the New World than the one we were taught in school. The case of the boy in the box. A name is the most fundamental part of an identity, the first word we learn that belongs to us, and the last that is spoken of us when we are gone. But for 65 long years, a young boy known to the city of Philadelphia and to the world had no name. He was a ghost child, a heartbreaking enigma known only by the grim manner of his discovery as the boy in the box. His case would become one of America's oldest and most profound unsolved mysteries, a decades-long quest by generations of detectives to give him back his name. The story begins in the cold winter of February 1957, in a wooded area in the Fox Chase neighborhood of Philadelphia. A young college student, checking on his muskrat traps, came across a large cardboard box that had once held a bassinet from a J.C. Penney store. Inside, wrapped in a worn plaid blanket, were the remains of a young boy, estimated to be between 4 and 6 years old. The initial investigation painted a grim picture of a short and difficult life. The boy was small for his age and showed signs of significant malnourishment. He had several small, well-healed scars on his body, including an L-shaped scar under his chin and surgical scars on his ankle and groin. But the most peculiar detail was his hair. It appeared to have been recently and crudely cut, with clumps of his own shorn hair still clinging to his person. The Philadelphia Police Department, horrified by the discovery, launched a massive and unprecedented effort to identify the unknown child. They distributed hundreds of thousands of posters with the boy's photograph. A desperate and unusual step for the time, the posters were placed in every post office and police station, and were even included with every single gas bill mailed to the residents of Philadelphia, in the hopes that someone, a neighbor, a relative, a teacher, would recognize the face of the missing boy. But the response was a deafening silence. Despite the immense publicity, not a single credible lead emerged. No one ever came forward to say they knew him. No missing persons report from anywhere in the country seemed to match his description. It was as if the boy had been completely invisible during his life. A child who had never existed in the eyes of the world until the day he was found. The few physical clues from the scene led nowhere. Investigators traced the bassinet box to a local J.C. Penney, but the records of the few who had bought one led to dead ends. The distinctive plaid blanket he was wrapped in was also traced, but it was a common type and provided no answers. For decades, the case went cold, but it was never forgotten. The city's investigators became the boy's surrogate family, and the case was passed down from one generation of detectives to the next, all determined to solve it. Over the years, two major theories emerged from the fog. For a long time, investigators, led by a dedicated examiner named Remington Bristow, focused on a nearby foster home. A psychic had directed Bristow to the home, and he developed a theory that the boy was the child of a family member of the man who ran the institution, and that his passing was accidental and had been secretly covered up to avoid a scandal. This lead was pursued for years, but could never be definitively proven. In 2002, a new and compelling lead surfaced. A woman, identified publicly only as M, or Martha, came forward with a detailed and disturbing story. She claimed her abusive mother had purchased the young boy, whose name was Jonathan, from his birth parents in. She alleged that he was subjected to years of horrific physical and emotional abuse, which eventually led to his tragic end. She claimed that it was her own mother who had crudely cut his hair, and that they had driven together to Fox Chase to leave his remains in the box. While her story matched many of the known details of the case, she had a history of mental illness, and police were never able to fully corroborate her account, leaving it in a state of frustrating ambiguity. The case remained cold, but science was continuing to advance. The boy's remains were exhumed in 1998, and again in 2019, as DNA technology improved. Hoping that genetic testing could finally provide a name, investigators began using the modern technique of forensic genealogy, the same method that has solved so many other famous cold cases. They extracted the boy's DNA, identified potential relatives, and began to painstakingly build a family tree. Finally, in December of 2022, after 65 long years, the city of Philadelphia held a press conference to announce a monumental breakthrough. They had finally identified the boy in the box. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born on January 30. He had a living birth mother and a large extended family on both sides, none of whom had apparently known what had become of him. The mystery of who he was has been solved, a testament to the incredible dedication of the investigators who refused to let him be forgotten. But this resolution has opened a new and final chapter in the case, the mystery of what happened to him. Now that they know his name and his family lineage, investigators are working to piece together the final tragic years of his short life, to uncover the circumstances that led to his demise, and to finally determine who left him in that cardboard box so long ago. The case is no longer about an unknown child. It is about finding justice for Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The Villisca Axe murders. In the heart of the American Midwest, in the early years of the 20th century, there existed a sense of profound peace and security. Small towns like Villisca, Iowa, were bastions of community, places of faith and simple decency, where people worked hard, attended church on Sundays, and left their doors unlocked at night. But on a single, moonless night in June of 1912, that comforting sense of safety was irrevocably shattered when an unknown intruder slipped into a modest family home and committed an act so strange and so unsettling that the town would never be the same again. The story is centered on the Moore family, a respected and well-liked family in the community. Josiah Moore was a successful local businessman, and he and his wife, Sarah, were raising their 4 young children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. On the evening of Sunday, June 9th, the entire family attended a Children's Day service at their local Presbyterian church, an event that Sarah had helped to organize. After the service, 2 young friends of the Moore children, Lena and Ina Stillinger, were invited to spend the night. The group of 8, 2 adults and 6 children, walked home together, arriving at the small, white frame house around 10 p.m. It was a perfectly normal end to a happy, community-focused day. It would be the last normal moment any of them would ever experience. The next morning, a concerned neighbor, Mary Peckham, noticed that the Moore house was unusually quiet. The family, who were early risers, had not started their morning chores, and the house remained still and silent. After her calls went unanswered, she contacted Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, who arrived with a key to the house. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, and it was he who made the grim discovery. A terrible act of violence had taken place. All 8 people in the house, the 2 adults in their downstairs bedroom and the 6 children in the rooms upstairs, had perished in their beds, their lives ended by severe head trauma inflicted by a heavy implement. The instrument, the Moore family's own axe, was found in the downstairs bedroom, wiped down but not perfectly clean, leaning against a wall. But it was the other details of the scene that elevated the crime from a simple, brutal act to a baffling and ritualistic mystery. Every mirror in the house and any other reflective glass surface, like the door windows, had been carefully covered with cloths and clothing. The faces of all 8 individuals had been covered with the bedclothes after the act had been committed, as if the perpetrator could not stand to be looked at, even by a reflection or by those who had already passed. In the downstairs bedroom, where the axe was found, investigators discovered a 2-pound slab of raw bacon leaning against the wall, and a small keychain that did not belong to the family. A pan of bloody water was found in the kitchen, suggesting the intruder had attempted to clean up, and all the doors to the house had been locked from the inside, the windows covered, before the perpetrator left. A search of the house also revealed that the intruder had likely spent a considerable amount of time in the home, waiting in the small attic for the family to fall asleep before descending to carry out the act. The investigation that followed was, by modern standards, a disaster. In the days after the discovery, hundreds of curious townspeople were allowed to tramp through the small house, contaminating the crime scene, touching objects, and destroying any potential evidence. Souvenirs were even taken. The small town's law enforcement was completely overwhelmed by a crime of such magnitude, and the investigation quickly devolved into a whirlwind of competing theories and public accusations that tore the community apart. The list of suspects was long and varied, but a few have remained at the center of the case for over a century. One of the most prominent was Frank Fife Jones, a powerful Iowa state senator, and Josiah Moore's former employer and direct business rival. Moore had worked for Jones for years before leaving to start his own, more successful farm implement store, a move that had created significant animosity between the two men. The theory was that Jones, a man known for his volatile temper, may have hired an associate to carry out the act as an extreme form of business revenge. Another compelling suspect was a man named Reverend George Kelly, an itinerant English minister who was in Villisca for the Children's Day service that the Moores had attended on their final night. Kelly was known for his strange behavior and had a history of mental health issues. He left town on a train at 5 a.m. on the morning of the discovery, and years later, he would deliver a rambling and detailed confession to the crime. However, High's confession was inconsistent, and after a lengthy trial, he was acquitted, though many still believe he was responsible. Investigators also looked at the possibility of a traveling serial perpetrator. A man named Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the family, had committed a string of similar acts across the Midwest with an axe, but he was reportedly in prison at the time of the Villisca event. Another suspect, William Blackie Mansfield, was a suspected enforcer and professional perpetrator, who one investigator believed was the man hired by Senator Jones to do the job. In the end, no one was ever convicted. The crime shattered the small town's sense of security. People began locking their doors for the first time, and the deep suspicion between neighbors lingered for generations. The Villisca Axe murders are more than just an unsolved case. They are a dark and deeply ingrained piece of American folklore. The house where the event took place still stands and is now known as one of the most famously haunted locations in the United States. Was it an act of personal revenge by a powerful business rival, the work of a disturbed transient minister, or the calling card of a traveling predator? The intruder who covered the mirrors and waited patiently in the attic walked out of the Moore family home and into history, leaving behind a terrifying and permanent question mark on the quiet heartland of America. The interstellar object Oumuamua. For all of human history, every object we have ever studied in our cosmic neighborhood, every planet, moon, asteroid, and comet has had one thing in common. They were all born here, members of our own solar system. But in 2017, for the very first time, our telescopes caught a fleeting glimpse of something new, a visitor from the vast, dark space between the stars. It was the first confirmed interstellar object ever detected, a messenger from an unknown sun, and its bizarre and completely unexpected properties have ignited one of the most profound and exciting debates in modern astronomy. The discovery was made on October 19, 2017, by the Pan-STARRS telescope in Hawaii. Astronomers spotted a faint point of light, moving so fast and on such an extreme trajectory that it was clearly not bound by our sun's gravity. It was a tourist, just passing through. They gave it a fittingly Hawaiian name, Oumuamua, a word that translates to a messenger from afar, arriving first, or simply, scout. By the time we saw it, it had already looped around our sun and was hurtling back out into the void, giving scientists only a few precious weeks to study it before it vanished forever. Everything they learned about Oumuamua was strange. We couldn't get a direct photograph, but by observing the way its brightness changed as it tumbled through space, astronomers could infer its shape, and it was unlike anything we have ever seen. It was extremely elongated, with a length-to-width ratio of perhaps 10:1, a shape often described as being like a giant cosmic cigar or a flat, thin pancake. a far cry from the lumpy potato-like asteroids we are used to. Its other properties were equally unusual. It was dense, likely made of rock or metal, and it had a dark, reddish hue, the result of being bombarded by cosmic rays for millions, or even billions of years during its long journey through interstellar space. It was also tumbling chaotically, not spinning smoothly on a single axis, but the most confusing clue was what it lacked. As Oumuamua passed close to our sun, the intense solar radiation should have heated it dramatically. If it were a comet, which is essentially a dirty snowball of ice and rock, this heat should have caused the ice to vaporize, creating a glowing halo of gas and dust around it, known as a coma or a visible tail. But Oumuamua had no coma. It was completely inert, like a dry, rocky asteroid. This is where the mystery deepens, because as Oumuamua was leaving our solar system, astronomers tracking its path noticed something that should have been impossible. It was accelerating. It was moving away from the sun slightly faster than the laws of gravity alone could explain. This was a non-gravitational acceleration, a faint but undeniable push from some other force. This single fact created a profound scientific contradiction. The only natural phenomenon known to cause such an acceleration in deep space is the gentle rocket effect of a comet outgassing as it's heated by a star. But as we know, Oumuamua showed no signs of outgassing. It had no coma, no tail. It was accelerating like a comet, but it looked like an asteroid. It was behaving in a way that defied our neat classifications of celestial objects. To solve this puzzle, astronomers have proposed a number of exotic, natural explanations. One theory suggests Oumuamua was a hydrogen iceberg, a solid chunk of frozen hydrogen that was knocked loose from a giant molecular cloud. This would explain the acceleration, as the hydrogen would have vaporized into a transparent, invisible gas. But it's unclear if such an object could even survive a long interstellar journey without evaporating. Another, more recent theory is that it was a nitrogen iceberg, a fragment of a Pluto-like nitrogen ice planet from another solar system, knocked into interstellar space by a cosmic collision. This is currently a leading natural explanation, as frozen nitrogen could provide the gentle, invisible push without creating a dusty, visible coma. But it is still a new and unproven type of object. But it is the third theory proposed by the then chair of Harvard's astronomy department, Avi Loeb, that is the most sensational and thought-provoking. Loeb argues that we should consider the possibility that Oumuamua was not a natural object at all, but a piece of alien technology. He points out that its strange, highly elongated shape, its high reflectivity, and especially its non-gravitational acceleration without any outgassing, are all consistent with what an artificial object might look like. He specifically proposes that Oumuamua could be a light sail, an incredibly thin and wide piece of technology designed to be pushed through space by the pressure of starlight itself, a concept we are developing here on Earth. This would perfectly explain the gentle acceleration without any need for a gaseous tail. In this view, Oumuamua was either an active probe, a piece of defunct alien equipment, or a sliver of debris from a larger craft, our first brief contact with a technology from beyond our solar system. This idea is, of course, highly controversial and is not accepted by the majority of the astronomical community, who believe a natural explanation, however exotic, will eventually be found. But the fact that such a theory is being seriously proposed by a top scientist shows just how strange and anomalous Oumuamua truly was. It has now left our solar system and will never return, leaving us with only the precious data from its brief and mysterious passage. Was it a new and bizarre type of natural object that has expanded our understanding of the cosmos? Or was it, as some have dared to suggest, our first fleeting glimpse of a piece of technology from another civilization? The silent visitor has returned to the interstellar darkness, leaving behind a profound and tantalizing question about the nature of the universe and our place within it. The legend of the Golem of Prague. For our final story, we journey to the heart of Old World Europe, to the city of 16th century Prague, a place of alchemical laboratories, astrological clocks, and deep, mystical traditions. In the winding, narrow streets of the city's Jewish ghetto, a story was born that would become one of the most powerful and enduring legends in all of folklore. It is a tale of persecution and protection, of sacred magic and unintended consequences. The story of a giant man made of clay, brought to life to defend his people, the creature known as the Golem of Prague. The central figure in this legend is a real historical person, Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel, known to the world as the Maharal of Prague. He was the chief rabbi and spiritual leader of the city's Jewish community in the late 1500s, a renowned scholar, philosopher, and a master of the mystical traditions of the Kabbalah, a man of immense intellect and deep faith. The legend is set against the grim backdrop of the blood libel, the false and horrific accusation that Jewish people were ending the lives of Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals. This vicious lie was often used as a pretext to incite violent mobs and pogroms against the Jewish ghettos of Europe. According to the legend, Rabbi Loew, seeing his community living in constant terror, prayed for a way to protect his people. In a divine vision, he was given a secret formula for the creation of a golem, a being from Hebrew folklore, an artificial man animated by sacred rites. The legend says that in the dead of night, Rabbi Loew took 2 assistants to the banks of the Thalava River, and then, using the wet clay from the riverbed, they sculpted the form of a large and powerful man. They then began a complex Kabbalistic ritual, walking around the clay figure while chanting sacred Hebrew names and incantations. The final crucial step was to give the golem the spark of life. In most versions of the tale, Rabbi Loew placed a piece of parchment with a Shem, a sacred name of God, into the golem's mouth, or inscribed the Hebrew word emet, meaning truth, onto its forehead. At that moment, the clay figure's eyes opened. It rose from the ground, a silent, powerful, and living being. The golem, often named Yosef, became the tireless guardian of the Prague ghetto. Its primary purpose was to patrol the narrow streets at night, a silent sentinel protecting the community from intruders and uncovering plots against them. It was a being of immense physical strength, capable of performing great feats of labor, but it was not a true human. It had no soul, no free will, and it could not speak. It was a purely functional, literal-minded automaton. This literal-mindedness sometimes led to trouble. Stories are told of the rabbi's wife asking the golem to perform simple chores, like filling the water barrels, only to return home to find the house completely flooded, as the golem, having been given no instruction to stop, continued to pour water until the barrels overflowed. The golem was a powerful tool, but a dangerous one that needed to be controlled. A crucial part of this control was the Sabbath, the Jewish day of rest. On every Friday evening before sunset, Rabbi Loew would deactivate the golem by removing the sacred Shem from its mouth, allowing the creature to rest as lifeless clay. The most famous part of the legend tells of one Friday evening when the rabbi, preoccupied with preparing for the Sabbath services, forgot. The golem, still animated, went on a destructive rampage through the ghetto, threatening to destroy everything. Rabbi Loew had to rush from the synagogue to confront the creature and remove the Shem, finally rendering it inert. According to the legend, after the golem had successfully protected the community from numerous threats, the Emperor Rudolf II finally issued a decree promising to end the persecution of the Jewish people. With its purpose served, and having grown wary of the creature's immense power, Rabbi Loew decided that the golem was no longer needed. He and his assistants led the golem to the attic of the old new synagogue, the heart of the community, and there they reversed the creation ritual. By erasing the first letter from the word emet, or truth, inscribed on its forehead, the word became met, the Hebrew word for death. At that moment, the golem's life force drained away, and it crumbled back into a lifeless statue of hard clay. Its remains were then sealed in the synagogue's attic, or genizah, a place for storing worn-out holy texts, and a strict prohibition was placed upon anyone ever entering the attic again. This is the core of the enduring mystery. Does the Golem of Prague still lie dormant and hidden in that dusty, sealed attic? For centuries, the legend has persisted. It is said that a Nazi agent who tried to enter the attic during the Second World War perished in the attempt. In modern times, the attic has been explored by researchers and even a television crew who found only old books and dust, but this has done little to diminish the power of the story for believers. The Golem of Prague is one of the most powerful and influential tales in all of folklore, a story born from a community's desperate need for a protector in a time of great fear. But it is also a profound and surprisingly modern allegory, a story about the relationship between a creator and their creation, and a cautionary tale about the dangers of artificial intelligence, a power that, once unleashed, can be difficult to control. The legend remains a cornerstone of Prague's mystical identity, a timeless story of faith, fear, and the powerful magic of bringing clay to life. This was the video.